September 11, 2001, a date that changed everything. For the first time in history, the world's only superpower was attacked on its own soil. The culprit, a radical network known as Al-Qaeda, and their host, the Taliban government ruling over the rugged terrain of Afghanistan. The United States issued a clear ultimatum: hand over the mastermind. Osama bin Laden, all faced the consequences. The Taliban flatly refused. So, on October 7, 2001, the planes started flying. Operation Enduring Freedom had officially begun, raining fire from the sky. In our animated universe, when a giant eagle gets angry, things move incredibly fast. The retaliation was swift and overwhelmingly powerful, relying on precision airstrikes and local rebel allies. The US military dismantled the Taliban's defenses with surgical efficiency. By December, just 2 months later, the Taliban had completely fled the major cities. The regime had collapsed like a house of cards. It looked like the shortest, most successful war in modern history. The enemy was scattered, and a new interim government was quickly formed. Victory was practically declared. A giant, mission accomplished, banner seemed ready to be unfurled across the world stage. But was it really over? Not quite. Behind the vibrant colors of our infographic maps, a complex problem was brewing. While the cities celebrated, a ghost was already forming in the treacherous, shadowy peaks of the Hindu Kush mountains. The surviving Taliban fighters didn't surrender, they simply melted away into the rocks, crossing the porous borders to wait it out. You see, winning a quick, decisive battle is relatively easy when you have stealth bombers and satellite-guided missiles at your disposal. But winning an entire country, changing the course of a tribal society that has resisted foreign invaders for thousands of years, that is a completely different story. And that's exactly where our historian penguin friend starts to sweat profusely. The initial ground invasion was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. Forget high-tech tanks, the first Americans arrived on literal horses. They linked up with local Northern Alliance rebels, combining local knowledge with the terrifying power of American air support. By November 2001, Kabul had fallen. To the world watching on TV, it looked like the Taliban were gone for good. A new era began. Schools reopened for everyone, music played in the streets again, and women returned to the workforce. For a moment, it felt like progress. According to Britannica, millions of Afghan girls entered schools for the first time in years. The international community applauded. It was the perfect success story. A brutal regime toppled and a democracy born overnight. An interim government was installed in Kabul. The mission seemed complete. But here lies the first and most fatal mistake. The US military treated the Taliban like a defeated conventional army that would simply surrender and go home. But in Afghanistan, home isn't just a place, it's a fortress of rock and shadow where you wait for the storm to pass. While the US celebrated, the Taliban leadership was simply crossing a very porous border into Pakistan. Moving into safety, this 1.600-mile border was impossible to close. It allowed the insurgency to survive, reorganize, and most importantly, wait. They knew something the superpower didn't. Superpowers have clocks. But the locals, they have time. Endless, patient time. And spoiler alert, superpowers have very short attention spans. Soon, a new, shiny object would appear to distract the eagle. By 2003, the focus shifted. Afghanistan became the forgotten war before it was even half finished. While Washington was distracted, the ghost in the mountains was slowly, patiently, regaining its strength. The real war was just beginning. Afghanistan is not merely a country, it's a brutal, three-dimensional geography exam designed by nature specifically to make invading armies fail. The majestic Hindu Kush mountain range stretches across the nation like a spine, with jagged, unforgiving peaks reaching over 25.000 feet into the sky. It's a natural labyrinth of deep valleys, hidden passes, and cave networks where the most advanced modern military technology literally goes to die. Think about it. Billion-dollar spy satellites hovering in orbit can read a license plate or track a moving car from space with ease. But they cannot see through thousands of feet of solid granite rock to find a hidden cave network where insurgents are having tea. And on the ground, heavy, technologically advanced tanks and armored vehicles are useless when they simply cannot climb 60-degree rocky slopes. This absolute geographical nightmare is exactly why the region earned its deeply infamous and terrifying nickname, the Graveyard of Empires. History has seen this before. Alexander the Great, the mighty British Empire in the 19th century, and the Soviet Union in the 1980s. They all marched in with superior weapons. And they all learned the exact same, devastating lesson the hard way. The golden rule of Afghanistan is this: a foreign superpower can easily conquer and hold the modern cities and the flat plains. But the thousands of isolated, rural valleys, those will always belong to the locals, who know every single rock and hidden trail. Our historian Penguin points to a tactical map. Look at the sheer scale of the problem. There are over 40,000 isolated villages scattered everywhere. To actually control and pacify Afghanistan, you don't just need airplanes, you need thousands of boots on the ground in every single valley. But in those crucial early years, the US had only about 10,000 soldiers for a country roughly the geographic size of Texas. But with the treacherous, cratered terrain of the moon, the strategic math simply didn't add up, leaving a massive vacuum for the enemy. Then, in 2003, something truly strange happened. Right when Afghanistan needed maximum attention, the superpower got severely distracted. The US essentially looked at the half-finished puzzle of Afghanistan, dropped the pieces, and said, let's start a much bigger puzzle next door. The invasion of Iraq acted like a giant vacuum cleaner. It instantly shifted the best satellites, the most elite troops, and crucial funding away from Kabul. For 5 absolutely critical years, Afghanistan was placed on the back burner. It quietly became the forgotten war in Washington's eyes. But an insurgency is like mold in a dark, damp room. If you stop shining a light on it, it doesn't die, it spreads. While the world watched Baghdad, the Taliban realized that the superpower had left the back door completely wide open. They spent those quiet years recruiting new fighters, exploiting local grievances, and funding themselves through the booming opium trade. They didn't fight big battles yet. They started small, a roadside hazard here, a tiny skirmish over there, testing the waters. By 2006, the reality was impossible to ignore. The insurgency wasn't just back, it was thriving across the entire southern region. Violence skyrocketed. The US military, realizing their mistake, tried to pivot back, scrambling to contain the growing fire. They relied heavily on what analysts called whack-a-mole tactics. A threat pops up in one valley. You fly over and hit it. But as soon as the troops left, 3 more threats popped up somewhere else. The sheer scale was exhausting the military machine. The fundamental flaw was strategic. You can easily destroy physical targets with $1 million Hellfire missile. But you absolutely cannot kill a radical idea with explosives, especially when that idea is fueled by foreign occupation. Realizing military force wasn't enough, Washington decided on a new, incredibly expensive strategy. Let's just build them a Western democracy from scratch. Now we officially enter the nation-building phase. The grand strategy was to combat radicalism not just with bullets, but with prosperity and infrastructure. The US seemingly decided that the best way to stabilize the country was to make rural Afghanistan look like, well, a suburb in Virginia. To achieve this impossible dream, they opened the floodgates and began pouring in an absolute tsunami of cash. And I mean a tsunami. According to official SIGAR reports, the government watchdog, the United States spent an absolutely astronomical amount of money on reconstructing this war-torn nation. In fact, adjusting for inflation, they spent more on rebuilding Afghanistan than on the entire Marshall Plan used to rebuild all of Europe after World War II. We are talking about over $145 billion dedicated exclusively to building things. It was a massive logistical undertaking unlike any other. Foreign contractors flew in, wide paved roads, modern medical clinics, and brand new schools began popping up across the rugged landscape. But here is the massive catch. A beautifully paved multi-million-dollar highway doesn't really help if the locals only have donkeys to travel. And it helps even less when insurgents sneak down from the mountains at night and simply blow up the newly built bridge the very next day. Our Penguin historian demonstrates. You shovel billions of green dollar bills into the top of the funnel, expecting a functioning, stable society to pop out. But instead, poof, the money simply evaporates into glowing star particles, disappearing into the chaotic, corrupt reality of a conflict zone. The core issue was deeply political. The West tried to forcibly install a massive, top-down centralized government with a powerful presidency in Kabul. However, we were trying to paste this modern system onto a fiercely independent, tribal society that relies on local elders, not distant politicians. This is a land that has been highly decentralized for over 2.00 years. They do not take kindly to strangers from the capital telling them what to do. Trying to change 2 millennia of culture overnight with an open checkbook wasn't just naive, it was structurally doomed to fail from the very beginning. So, the obvious question is, where exactly did all that staggering amount of money go? Well, much of it vanished into what we can only describe as a bureaucratic black hole. Instead of building the promised schools and hospitals, billions of dollars were siphoned directly into the extremely deep pockets of regional warlords and highly corrupt local officials. The internationally backed, centralized government in Kabul essentially began to function less like a democracy and more like a giant, incredibly inefficient ATM machine for the elite class. American officials often knew exactly what was happening behind closed doors, but they were trapped in a strategic dilemma. They desperately needed these unsavory allies to fight the insurgency. This blatant corruption led to the infamous ghost soldier phenomenon. The US military was funding salaries and equipment for hundreds of thousands of Afghan security forces, who simply did not exist outside of a spreadsheet. The money for these phantom soldiers went straight to the bank accounts of the corrupt commanders. This created a highly toxic, self-defeating cycle on the ground that actively undermined the entire multi-billion-dollar mission from the inside out. The more money the superpower pumped into the system in a desperate attempt to buy stability, the more corrupt, bloated, and disconnected the local government actually became. And who was watching all of this unfold? The average Afghan civilian, who stood by watching their own leaders getting fabulously rich while their villages remained in poverty. Frustration and deep resentment naturally began to boil over across the countryside. After all, why would you risk your life to support a government that actively steals from you? The Taliban quickly seized this perfect propaganda opportunity. They rebranded themselves, pointing directly at the rampant corruption and presenting themselves to the locals as the pure, incorruptible alternative. As our Penguin historian notes, it is physically impossible to win hearts and minds when the locals see your chosen democratic allies literally stealing their neighbor's goat. The financial disparity was truly sickening to look at. By 2010, the United States was burning through roughly $100 million every single day to keep the war going. Yet, despite this astronomical level of daily spending, the average Afghan civilian was still struggling to survive on less than $2 miserable a day. The infographic warning bars on our screen are basically screaming in bright red. The entire foundation of the ambitious nation-building project was completely rotting from the inside out. By 2010, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. To break the insurgency's momentum, the United States decided on one final, massive military gamble, the surge. President Obama ordered tens of thousands of additional troops into the country, temporarily bringing the total U.S. presence to a staggering 100,000 boots on the ground. Tactically, this overwhelming brute force worked exactly as intended. The U.S. military successfully pushed the insurgents back, violently clearing key valleys and recapturing lost territory. But military strategists quickly realized they were essentially pressing their foot down on a giant, heavily coiled metal spring. As long as you push, it stays down. The moment the troops began to withdraw and hand control back to local forces, the spring bounced right back. The Taliban simply waited out the surge. It became a bloody, agonizing stalemate. The United States was vastly too powerful to actually lose a battle, but structurally unable to win the war. Back home, the conflict slowly faded from daily headlines. It tragically became background noise, an endless war playing silently on televisions in completely empty living rooms. The war dragged on for so long that an entire generation of American soldiers grew up, deployed, and returned home, only to see their own children enlist. Fathers and sons literally ended up deploying to fight in the exact same valleys, against the very same relentless insurgency, exactly 2 decades apart. And the true cost in human lives was absolutely staggering, mostly borne by thousands of Afghan civilians caught endlessly in the crossfire of this geopolitical tug-of-war. By 2020, even the mighty American eagle was utterly exhausted. The domestic political will to keep spending billions of dollars and shedding blood had completely evaporated. Washington finally decided it was time to negotiate an exit. They met directly with the Taliban leadership in Doha to draft a formal, historic withdrawal agreement. But there was one glaring, absolutely fatal omission in these peace talks: the US-backed Afghan government wasn't even invited to their own table. This immediately signaled to everyone in the entire country that the Kabul government was a flimsy house of cards, ready to collapse the moment American air support vanished. The deal was signed. The giant, glowing neon, EXIT, sign was officially turned on. The superpower was leaving the graveyard, no matter what happened next. August 2021. The world watched in absolute shock as the massive, 2-decade-long nation-building project entirely collapsed in a mere 11 days. As the US troops began their final withdrawal, the Taliban swept across the infographic map like a spilled bucket of thick red paint. Without the umbrella of American air support and logistics, the Afghan National Army, that fragile house of cards, simply disintegrated into the wind. By August 15th, Taliban fighters casually walked into the grand halls of the presidential palace, the very same palace they had fled exactly 20 years earlier. The chaotic, heartbreaking scenes at Kabul airport broadcasted a stark reality to the globe, a superpower desperately rushing to leave its own failed experiment. As the final planes lifted off into the night sky, the giant eagle looked down at the rugged, unconquerable mountains one last time. Our Penguin historian closes the heavy book on a conflict that defined a generation. Let's look at the final, staggering receipts of this endeavor. 20 long years of non-stop conflict, a total financial cost estimated at a mind-bending $2.3 trillion spent by the United States. And most tragically, over 170.000 lives lost, represented here by these glowing stars floating into the void, a devastating human toll. And the final, deeply ironic result: the Taliban are sitting back in the exact same palace seats they were bombed out of in 2001. So, what is the ultimate lesson here? It's a harsh truth about the limits of absolute military and financial power in the modern world. You simply cannot outsource a soul to a corrupt government. You cannot bomb a culture into submission. And you cannot plant a foreign tree in solid rock. Afghanistan remains the graveyard of empires, not because its people are inherently warlike, but because the land and its ancient tribal structures are completely unyielding to outsiders. History, it seems, loves a circle, even when it is a very, very expensive one. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe and check out these videos.